Section 2 of Dog Heroes of Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Myra Parker. Dog Heroes of Many Lands by Sarah Noble Ives. Chapter 2. Zip, a Dog of the Northland. In the white reaches of the great Northeast Territory of the British possessions stands East Main Fort, a solitary building of logs facing St. James Bay. Year in and year out, 5 or 6 men are exiled here in the service of the Hudson's Bay Company, and the life is not a merry one. Nothing breaks the stillness save the song of the wind under the stout eaves of the fort and the grinding of the ice in the shallow bay. When the wind is abroad of an autumn night, the dull grumble of the ice pack becomes a mingling of a scream and a roar as the great cakes rip each other's sides, crack in pieces, and pile themselves upon each other. Later the Arctic reaches down its grim fingers and weaves the bergs into a web of solid ice, as immovable as the snow barrens lying alongside for hundreds of miles toward the twilight of the polar zone. Ice and snow, nothing else to see till summer breaks through for her brief reign and spreads her mantle of coarse grass, hardy flowers, and mosses over the barrens, and sets the ice cakes to tossing once more in the troubled waters. Beyond the trapping of Arctic animals, nothing ever happens save the occasional mails and the coming of the yearly supply ship. In the long days, the little steamer anchors off the mouth of the East Main River, and then comes the great bustle of the year. The lonely men awaken from their surly humors and revel in the greeting with the sailors, the business of canoeing or sledging the supplies into camp, and best of all, in the messages and packages from loved ones in the happy Southland. Then one hears laughter, and the men play and joke with each other like rough boys. Then there are hearty farewells as the little ship steams away to make other men glad, and as she dips out of sight, the men return for another year to their solitude. From time to time, other mails arrive at the lonely camp, and for the Canadian members of the little group, these have their special joys. The arrival of one of these precious bags is a wonderful break in the monotony. Sometimes these messages from the outer world come through Hudson Straits, sometimes by dog train from Lake Superior. Sometimes they come through the great Ottawa forests up from Montreal, and sometimes there are long months of snowy silence when no word of life outside reaches the lonely little fort. Then the long nights seem never-ending, and the winter sun, hanging pale above the horizon, cheers them but for a little while. No wonder, then, if a month seems like a year. No wonder that the men grow surly and morose. No wonder that, in the face of the sheer blank wall of white sameness, one of the number will suddenly go mad. We who live in the world of realities cannot conceive of the horror that sometimes settles down upon the soul of a man in the grip of the icy northern silences. Then he sees visions, and dreams dreams, and fancies insults. It takes courage and grit and endurance to stay for 4 or 5 years in the jumping-off places of the round earth and come out whole and sane. There is one item that goes to make life possible, a most important item, too. That is the snarling, yelping pack of dogs, the huskies of the Arctic regions. They are usually ill-natured, surly beasts, showing little affection for each other and none for the men, trained as they are to obey at the end of a whiplash. Yet they are courageous, brave, sturdy chaps. With thick, woolly coats to protect them from the nipping frosts, they can endure and live where men fall and perish from cold and exhaustion. Indeed, the lives of men would be worth little without these 4-footed helpers. At East Main Fort in the year 1890, there were 4 men stationed. Attached to the camp was a train of 8 or 10 sledge dogs. All but one of them were of the pure northern breed, and closely akin to the fierce wolves that haunt the Canadian forests and barrens. But Zip was different. Zip boasted a Scotch collie mother, and to her blood in his veins he owed his high moral sense and his more tractable nature. He did not snarl and fight with the pack. He held himself aloof and dignified, as became the foregoer in the sledge harness. On the trail he preserved discipline among his fellows. They knew he was master, and obeyed him, for he had fought it out at the start with the whole pack, one by one. Mutiny on the trail meant certain punishment from Zip, and the dogs behaved accordingly. So they worked together in a sort of savage harmony, bowing to the greater intelligence of the partly civilized Zip. While the whiplash of the driver, who ran on snowshoes at the side of the train, fell often on the unruly, purebred huskies, it seldom troubled Zip, who was nearest it. Unless the driver was a stranger, and because of his human qualities, there grew up a fondness between Zip and Francois Delard, a descendant of the old French stock of Evangeline's Acadia. The other men at the fort were Brainerd, Carson, and Boyle, Britons all, brave, fearless, steady, and sturdy. But they were not so keen at the trapping nor successful at handling the dogs as Francis. Perhaps it was because Zip helped him more willingly for the sake of the occasional caress that he had learned to look for. At any rate, when an expedition was undertaken which required swiftness and endurance, Francois was generally chosen to head it. So it came about that he and Zip were the heroes of this story. Spring had come in, and the sun rose earlier and lingered longer with each succeeding day, with long, strange twilights that almost met and conquered the darkness of midnight. 8 months of the year had gone by without a sign or greeting from warmer lands, when across the lonesome reaches of the still frozen St. James Bay, Brainerd saw a black point. As it drew nearer, it resolved itself into a row of black points, and later into a sledge team and 2 men. The camp woke up with a bang. Extra logs were heaped on the fire, and by the time the half-frozen men arrived at the stockade, things were ready for a great welcome. The men shouted to one another and to the newcomers. The dogs of the sledge barked a fierce challenge to the huskies of the fort pack. The kettle in the coffee pot hissed and bubbled, and the fire roared up the chimney with mighty sighs of welcome to those who were bringing life and wholesome thought to the lonely trappers. It was, "Hello, Brainerd, what's the news?" "None here. What you got?" "Mail." "Whoop! Give us the bag." "Hi, fellers. Mail, mail." "Hurrah! Whoop! Help yourselves to coffee and bacon while we tend to this. You, Carson, Boyle, hands off. I'm opening Her Majesty's budget." Brainerd's trembling fingers unlocked the bag, and dry sobs of eagerness came from the other 3 men as they clutched their precious packets. Brainerd's 2 children had written. Boyle's old mother had penned a long letter of yearning love. Carson's wife begged him to give up the Hudson's Bay trade and come back to her, no matter if they starved. And Francois Delard, oh yes, there was a letter, 2, 3, 4, all in the same cramped handwriting from the little black-eyed girl who was waiting for him in Nova Scotia. And that was not all. There were packages of comforts, mittens, socks knitted by loving hands, tobacco, tea, coffee, maple sugar, and best of all, no bad news for anybody. It was a grand mail bag. One of the newcomers paused as he poured his second cup of coffee. "There's another bag." "Hey, you son of a gun, fetch her in. Hustle, man." "Go easy now. No need for you to be anxious. 'Tain't for you at all. It's for Fort Stewart, and the joke is on you, for orders is for you to tote it. We got to push on to Fort George with another. And then," the speaker added, "it's home and Peggy for me, and no more life in the Arctics." "And we've got 2 more years of this cold hell afore our time's up." "Well, Fort Stewart's our next-door neighbor. They'll be as glad as ourselves to get the bag," said Brainerd. "How about it, Delard? You feel like taking a 100-mile promenade to jolly up the fellows off toward the rising sun?" "Moi? Oui, I'll tote 'em." In the joy of his 4 letters from Marie, Francis would gladly have extended happiness over the 4 corners of the earth. There might be something in that bag for Bernard, from his Jeanette. 100 miles, nothings. I make 'em in 3-4 day. I take a zip, yes? And Napoleon, said Carson. He's the next best husky. Also, I take a whiskey and brandy. They go fellows too. 40's enough, eh? You couldn't have a better day to start. Cloudy, not enough snow falling to hurt anything. Not so cold that your fingers will freeze to the harness buckles. Will you do it alone or take Boyle? It is not necessary for sin too. That trail, he is easy. The sledge was packed with Francois's camping outfit and food, with frozen fish for the dogs and the bag of paper jewels for the men at Fort Stewart. Blankets and robes were added, and everything was lashed fast to the sledge. Zip danced, barking madly, to his station. The other 3 dogs fell into their places in the harness, all eager to be off and away. Then Francois appeared, clad in furs and woolens, snug and trig for the journey, with his snowshoes firmly strapped and his long whip in hand. "Marche!" he cried, and with a swing and a jingle the train started over the inland trail that led to Fort Stewart. Snowy, trackless waste that it was, there was no hesitation as to the right direction. Every dog and man knew the trails from camp to camp as instinctively as the birds of the air. Francis picked up the landmarks without a pause anywhere for consideration, and if he had not known, Zip had taken the trail many a time and needed no guiding. Lightly, Francois swung alongside the dogs, his heart keeping merry time as it beat beneath 4 letters from Marie. 2 years more, and he would go back to Nova Scotia, and there would be a wedding and a little house furnished with his savings, not too far from the lumber camps. Then no more trapping in the bleak barrens of the north, but a wife and fireside and babies to toss and hum to sleep with his merry French songs. From very joy, Francois sang now. Il y avait un bergeret, et ron ron ron, petit patapon. Il y avait un bergeret, qui gardait ses moutons, ron ron, qui gardait ses moutons. Le bergeret fait fromage, et ron ron ron, petit patapon, le bergeret. The merry madness of the tune ran with the creak of the sledge runners, the jingle of the harness, the crack of the whip, and the glad beatings of the heart of Francis. Et ron ron ron, petit patapon. Up and on, over the echoless wastes, keeping as much as possible to the northern land slopes, for already the sun was making soft patches in the snow on the southern slants where the dogs might flounder and snowshoe and sledge break through. Following no beaten track and needing none, onward they went to Fort Stewart. The snow fell so quietly and gently that it was a pleasure rather than a hindrance. The soft gray light of the cloudy day was a blessing to eyes tired of the white monotony. The dogs leaped to their task, glad of the chance to run after the confinement of the stockade. At noon they halted, and Francois made tea on his Eskimo stone lamp. Only a short rest now, for they were fresh, and they must make the most of their good traveling weather. Then on until weariness told them it was time to make camp. Francois dug a deep hole in the snow and warmed his solitary supper with more tea, while the dogs barked and snarled over their ration of frozen fish. A light wind was rising, but the shelter of the snow walls kept them comfortable, as comfort goes when one sleeps in the open of an Arctic night. Through the short darkness and the long pale twilight, Francois slept at the bottom of his hole with a blanket of dogs above his robes. For no sooner had he settled himself than all 4 of the shaggy fellows heaped themselves on top, and he lay warm and cozy until morning. Breakfast all around, and another day of travel through a colder air, for the wind was blowing now, bitter and biting. The snow had ceased falling, and as they made camp for the second night, the sun broke through the clouds and shone on them for a few minutes. They were halfway on their journey, and far more weary than on the night before. Snuggled together again, they knew nothing of the march of the heavens above them, saw nothing of the stars that tripped out to do homage to the King Pole Star on his throne of wavering, shifting light, nothing of the clouds as they slipped away and vanished. When Francois finally stirred his stiffened limbs and shook off the heap of dogs and blankets, he was greeted by a blaze of sunshine. Not the sunshine that cheers and warms, but that frigid variety that mocks one with its brightness. The sky was a pale, unbroken blue, not a fleck of cloud anywhere. Francois hunted for his smoked glasses, for even the Eskimo wears his spectacles of horn, and he must shelter his eyes from the myriad points of fresh-fallen snow crystals that glittered like crusted gold between him and the low-hanging sun toward which he must start on his journey. Everywhere he looked in vain for the precious glasses. He had forgotten to bring them. There was a long day before him of dazzling light, and already there were pains darting through his eyes. Francis pulled his cap low on his forehead and started, with a great fear welling up in his breast, the fear of snow blindness, the curse of the lands of many snows. Once before that spring his eyes had been weakened by exposure, and he had seen men struck blind, a blindness from which they did not recover for days and weeks. "I must get out of dis quick. Hi, you Zip, Napoleon, whiskey, brandy. We got to get on very quick." A hurried breakfast, then marche, and they were away. Francois did not sing now, but he made sure that Marie's letters were safe in his breast pocket. The round sun glared pitilessly. Thank the kind Virgin that there was no wind to make matters worse. From under his cap he squinted across the snow reaches for the landmarks by which to guide his dogs. Bravely they went on, 50 miles yet to cover. The pain in his eyes grew more intense with every moment, and he stumbled along without opening them as long as he dared. But the direction must be kept, for the dogs would follow his lead to whatever point he might turn them. One more glimpse he must take. His sense of the direction of the sun was dulled by the splitting pain. A quick glance out along the trail, and then the disaster was upon him. A flood of scarlet light seemed to surge through and through his whole being, and the nerves of his eyeballs quivered to the shock. Then a roar like an ocean surf in his ears, balls of fire that shot hither and thither, then again the floods of scarlet light, as if his whole brain had been one great blaze. That terrible glare! It seemed as if all the light of the sun were eating through his cap and into his tortured eyes. With a groan he threw himself on his face in the snow, trying to find the darkness that would not come to him. "Ah, c'est que Sainte Vierge Marie," he cried as the pain grew more and more intense, and he dug down into the snow with mittened fingers, thankful for the small relief that the cold gave to the fiery horrors he was enduring. "Ah, c'est que Marie." The crack of his whip no longer sounded, but the dogs traveled on, unmindful, until Zip observed that all was not as usual. Something was wrong, quite wrong. The sound of Francis's snowshoes no longer creaked at his side. Zip halted the procession and looked around. There was a dark spot on the snow, back in the tracks they had just made. That must be his master. There was no voice to guide the dogs forward or back. What to do? But Napoleon and brandy and whiskey knew what to do. Their morning rations had been too small altogether. There was no restraining whip, and there lay the sledge, and the frozen fish was to be got at by digging and scratching off the straps and coverings. The 3 huskies threw themselves on the sledge and began the attack. Through the roar of his bursting brain, Francois heard the snarling and fighting of the pack as they smelled the fish. Now they were tearing at the inner covering, and now they were yelping and snapping as they reached the coveted provender. This could not go on. If the dogs ate all of the fish, they would next get at Francois's own food, and that would mean death for them all. The man struggled to his feet and groped his way in the direction of the sounds. With his whip he laid about him until Napoleon slunk back to his place behind Zip, whiskey and brandy following, grumbling their disappointment. What was to be done? What could be done without eyes to see? He could not drive the dogs straight. He could not stay there and do nothing. Some kind of camp must be made. Francois stooped and loosened his snowshoes. With one of them he started digging in the snow. He worked doggedly, with closed eyes, throwing out the snow with great scoops. thanking heaven it was not hard packed, and also that the exertion put new warmth in his benumbed arteries. There was no stopping to rest. In an hour he had dug a hole 7 feet deep and 5 feet across the top. Banking this on the outside, it made a much warmer place to stop, and he was at least protected from the bleak and awful cold of the level surface. Protected, too, from the rays of the low sun, every glimpse of which meant agony to his tortured eyes. Now he cut the dogs loose, and by laying the sledge bottom across the top of the hole, he accomplished 2 things. He made the pack slashed to it safe from the hungry dogs, and he secured for himself deeper shadows. Into the hole he threw his blankets and robes, and stumbled in after them. Always the floods of burning light seared his eyeballs. Even with his face plunged deep in a blanket, there was no relief. "Marie, Sainte Mère," he groaned. Then his hand went to his breast, feeling for the 4 letters from that other earthly Marie. Oh, he must live until someone found him. He must live. His mittened fingers closed tightly around the envelopes, and there was comfort in the feel of them. In spite of the pain he suffered, he fell gradually into a doze, and then into a deep sleep. Something stirring nearby wakened him. A dog was licking his hand. It was Zip. He alone of all the dogs at the fort ever caressed or showed love for a master. The collie blood in Zip was stirring. Something was wrong with Francis. When one is on a journey, one does not lie so long with one's eyes to the ground. Zip whined a little, and shaking off his stupor, Francis rose, felt about him for the stone lamp, melted a pint of snow, and made some weak tea. He ate some pemmican, and the other dogs, smelling the food, began quarreling and growling, while Francois unlashed from the sledge a package of frozen fish and fed them. With his eyes closed and the hungry brutes snarling about him, almost he felt afraid. Why might they not attack him when the fish should fail? But there they were. And after all, there was comfort even in their companionship, and they kept him from freezing. It came on to snow. The crystals fell on Francis's face through the spaces at the sides of the sledge above him. Shifting the sledge to the windward, he huddled himself back under it. With the dogs packed tight around him and over him, together they shivered through the Arctic storm. Unless his eyesight should come back to him soon, he must surely freeze to death. To try to travel, not seeing where, would be the height of madness. God knows where they might fall at last, to die in the stern clutches of hunger and cold. There was nothing to do but wait. His feet began to grow numb. Torpor had spread over his whole body, and he had no energy to rub them. How another day and night passed he never knew. He dreamed strange dreams and saw things that never existed. The scarlet flame in his eyes spun itself into strands of wonderful and evanescent colors. He was aware of something leaping past him, and was it a shower of stars that fell about him, or was it only snow? Maybe one of the dogs had left him. But it did not come back, and he could not see the dark form as it slipped away silently and was swallowed up in the night. No, it must have been a dream. For now ghostly figures came and went in and out of the hole in the snow, moving shapes, noiseless and mysterious. Now he was moving himself, traveling fast and faster on his snowshoes down a great slope to the south, and at the bottom lay water. Never stopping, in he plunged, and when he came up there were green trees and verdant meadows all around. He was one of a crowd of little boys again, by the side of the Bay of Fundy. Now he was canoeing, with his paddle dipping swift and silent in the waters of a little stream in Nova Scotia. As he drew near the shore he saw Marie, little Marie with the black eyes and rosy cheeks. She stepped into the bow of his canoe, and together they sped away through a summer land. Now it grew colder, and snow fell, and there was floating ice that crushed against the frail canoe and threatened to upset it. Marie at the bow grew rigid in the cold, and now it was not Marie at all, but a snow figure, and it weighted down the canoe until the icy waters crept over the gunwale, and down, down again he went with a gurgle. Everything became black and cold and silent. A long, long silence. It was good to be down under the waves where there was no sun, no bitter wind, no snow. Perhaps this was death. Well, it was easy going this way, slipping into the unknown without an effort, down, down. Marie would be sorry, but out across the gray twilight of the northern night, a silent shape was traveling, moving swiftly in a straight line, no matter what the impediment, toward Fort Stewart. Always on, stopping only once or twice to pant or to lick a bleeding paw. A dog with a heart of love for the man who was gentle and affectionate to him, the man who caressed him. And that man lay in a hole in the snow, freezing slowly. Death was not far away. Dimly in his dog brain, Zip knew that help must be summoned. On and on, over the trail they had taken, he traveled through the great silences. Zip, the half-collie with the human intelligence. Zip, the half-husky with the sturdy, long-enduring body. Zip, whom everybody for 300 miles around knew as an East Main Fort dog, and a good one. Zip, the wise and tender. In that night, when Francois began to see visions and dream dreams, Zip knew that things were not as they should be, and he stole from the shelter of the snow hole and continued on the trail to Fort Stewart. Many times he had traveled it, and he knew as well as Francois, nay, better, every landmark of the way. 50 miles he journeyed alone over the snow reaches, and at last he barked at the gates of the fort. The men, tumbling out at the sound, found a dog, with bits of harness hanging to him, and snow and ice in his tangled fur. Exhausted he was, but eager to be off and lead them somewhere. It did not take the men long. In half an hour a second dog train was ready, and Zip took the lead. Back again over his old trail he started bravely, but in a little while he stumbled and fell. Pluckily he rose and started again, but not for long. He fell and could not rise, but lay there whining and ashamed. And now the men knew that he was too worn out for further travel, and they prepared their minds for a long trip. Zip was huddled in furs and put on the sledge, where he rode in state as a passenger, while the other dogs took the fresh trail. Easy it was to follow over the snow barrens, and the men went swiftly alongside on their snowshoes. 50 miles, straight as the crow flies, they followed Zip's trails. Every plunge and stride and leap was plainly to be seen in the fresh white layer of frost jewels. How had the dog done it? Why had he gone to Fort Stewart instead of turning back to East Main Fort for help? No one knows, but he had done this thing and was still alive. On the second day he grew suddenly uneasy, and being rested with the ride of the day before, he took the trail again, leading and barking back to be sure that the others followed. Now in the far distance a dark spot showed against the gleaming white. Zip gave a joyful bark, and outdistancing the train, disappeared bodily in the snow. Something stirred Francis as he lay in a numb unconsciousness. Then suddenly out of the silent depths he shot up to life again. Somebody pulled him up by the arms. A dazzling gleam of sunlight smote his eyes, and he cried out with the pain. Somebody was rubbing him with snow and working his arms and legs. He tried to speak, but could only mumble something unintelligible. Then there was more rubbing, until the blood began once more to creep through his veins, and the agony of it brought him broad awake. Somebody hurled a dozen rapid questions at him in French. That was Bernard's voice. Bernard of Fort Stewart. Had he reached there in spite of the snow blindness? Now he knew that there were two men, though he could not see them, and at his side was a dog, whining and licking his face and stiffened fingers. Zip. Good old Zip was there. "You, Zip," were Francis's first two sounds that anyone could recognize for words, and Zip gave a great bark and leaped upon him with delighted caresses. "Where am I?" said Francis in French, and Bernard, his friend, answered in the same beloved tongue of the Acadian habitant. "We just pulled you out of your cache. You had a close call. How did you find me?" "Zip told us. Night before last he came to the fort. He led us back here." "The other dogs?" There were 3 jumped out of the hole when they heard us." Francis nodded as he gulped hot coffee. "They lay on top of me and kept me from freezing. Zip, he brought you and saved my life. Good old great heart, Zip. There's a hunter at the fort who will give the chief facteur $50 for Zip, an enormous sum for a husky. And the chief facteur, said Francois, will tell him to keep his $50. If he were mine, I'd not sell him for 1,000. Then to himself he murmured, as he felt in his breast pocket for 4 crumpled letters. No, not even to get sooner the little home for Marie and me. End of section 2. Recording by Myra Parker.